Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission is, well, it's always the same. We take a stack of really complex sources, we pull out the most crucial knowledge, and we give you the definitive shortcut to being well informed. And today we are diving deep into a topic that's, it's fascinating, but also pretty fraught.
Oh, absolutely.
It sits right at this intersection of faith, history, and modern science. We're talking about the massive conflict between DNA studies and the traditional narratives about the ancestry of Native Americans.
And specifically, how those traditions connect to the historical claims in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
The stakes here are they're profound. Especially for anyone who grew up with a traditional understanding. For over a century, the belief was incredibly straightforward.
Simple.
Yeah. Native Americans were descended from groups called Lamanites and Nephites. They migrated from the Near East, the Jerusalem area, around 600 BC.
So the expectation was simple.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When modern genetic sequencing started, the hypothesis was we should find Hebrew or Middle Eastern DNA markers all over the American continents.
And what we found was, well, it wasn't a small disagreement. It was a deeply uncomfortable scientific result.
To say the least.
The research on modern and even ancient Native American populations shows that their ancestry is overwhelmingly Asiatic, East Asian, not Middle Eastern.
And this isn't about, trying to disprove faith.
No, not at all.
It's about exploring the really complex data that came out when genetics suddenly gave us this high-resolution photo of the past.
A photo that told a very different story.
A very different story. I mean, the scientific paradigm for how the Americas were populated has long been that people arrived via the Bering Land Bridge.
Beringia.
Right, from Northeast Asia, probably in multiple waves, thousands and thousands of years ago. And the first genetic data just confirmed this, overwhelmingly.
So when they looked for those Israelite or Semitic markers,
They just weren't there. Not as
Yeah.
a primary signature. So right away, the scientific findings were in direct contradiction with the idea of a solely or even a major Israelite colonization in the 6th century BC.
let's unpack just how central that traditional claim was. For a lot of people, this wasn't some minor detail.
No, it was core.
It was a core identity marker, and it was institutionalized in the 1981 introduction to the Book of Mormon, which stated explicitly that the Lamanites were the principal ancestors of the American Indians.
That phrase, principal ancestors, it reflected generations of consistent teaching.
And it created a clear scientific expectation.
It did, because the Lehi migration, it wasn't just some random group. The text, the brass plates, it claims a very specific ancestry for Lehi.
He was a direct descendant of Joseph of Egypt.
From the tribe of Manasseh, that is unequivocally Middle Eastern. So when researchers couldn't find those specific expected markers, it posed a profound problem for that traditional consensus.
And this didn't stay in, academic circles.
Not for long.
It boiled over into the public, I think most famously in 2002. A German reporter asked then LDS President Gordon B. Hinckley about the DNA evidence.
And his response was very cautious. He said that hasn't been determined yet.
Right. But that whole period was just electric. You had documentaries coming out like DNA versus the Book of Mormon, arguing that DNA was like court of law evidence, and it was deeply challenging people's testimonies.
And it's fascinating, just from a purely scientific standpoint, to look at the clarity of the evidence that caused all this. When we look at the genetics, we see these specific genetic signatures. They're called haplogroups.
Okay, haplogroups. For anyone listening who might be, I don't know, prepping for a meeting and doesn't want to get bogged down in jargon, what is that in this context?
Yeah, good question. Think of them as deep genetic signposts. A haplogroup is just a large family of genes that are inherited from a single common ancestor. We look at mitochondrial DNA from the mother and Y chromosome DNA from the father.
So you can map human migration over millennia.
Precisely.
Got it. So what do those signposts tell us about Native Americans?
They tell us the maternal lines fall overwhelmingly into 5 major groups, A, B, C, D, and X. The paternal lines are mostly C and Q.
And the key insight is?
The key insight is that all of those haplogroups are commonly found in Siberia, Southeast Asia, and Eurasia. The evidence points overwhelmingly to a founding population that split off from Northeast Asia and came across what's now the Bering Strait.
There's no major identifiable Near Eastern signature from a 600 BC arrival.
None.
And if the geography wasn't enough of a problem, there's the timeline.
The timeline is a huge hurdle.
We're not talking about small gaps here. DNA from ancient remains like the Sunrise Child Girl in Alaska pushes human presence in the Americas back as far as what, 20,000 years ago?
at least, which drastically predates the 600 BC arrival of Lehi's group.
That's a 19,400-year difference.
It's a critical gap. And for those working in the traditional theological framework, it also conflicts with the older Orthodox timeline that put Adam and Eve at around 7,000 years ago. So the genetics challenge the narrative both coming into the Americas and going all the way back to human origins.
So faced with this overwhelming scientific consensus and the public challenge, the church made a really strategic, though it sounds minor, a textual adjustment.
They did. In 2006, and it was formalized in the 2013 edition, the introduction to the Book of Mormon was revised. The Lamanites were changed from being the principal ancestor
To among the ancestors.
to among the ancestors of American Indians, yes. The official reason cited was for clarity and greater accuracy.
That one word change principle to among, I mean, you could argue it's one of the most consequential single word revisions in modern religious scholarship.
Oh, it's massive.
It alters the entire scope of the book's historical claims. It allowed for the widespread acceptance of what is now called the limited geography model.
A huge shift. This model suggests that Lehi's family inhabited only a small, localized area, maybe Mesoamerica, maybe the heartland, and, critically, they settled among huge, pre-existing populations.
Populations that were already there.
Already there, non-Lehite, and had arrived thousands of years earlier from Asia.
What I find so interesting is that this idea wasn't brand new. It wasn't just invented because of the DNA evidence.
That's right. Versions of the limited geography model had been suggested by thoughtful LDS scholars for a long time. People like P.H. Roberts, J.M. Sodalal, way back in the early 1900s.
So they were looking at the text itself, the geography of the battles, and so on.
Exactly. But it only became the widely adopted, kind of acceptable official explanation after the DNA evidence completely demolished the older idea.
And that older idea being the hemispheric geography model.
The hemispheric model, yeah. That was the standard belief, promoted by early leaders like Orson Pratt in the 1840s.
Yeah.
It claimed the entire American continent was basically empty when Lehi got here.
Meaning all Native Americans were universally and exclusively descendants of Lehi.
A concept the DNA evidence proved was fundamentally inconsistent with reality. It couldn't stand.
So the limited geography model is, in a way, brilliant because it directly addresses the DNA. It says, okay, we know the vast majority of people were Asiatic. Lehi's group was just a tiny drop in a very large ocean.
Right. But it means you have to read the text through a very specific lens.
Yeah. You have to reinterpret scriptures that seem to imply a clean slate.
You do. For instance, 2 Nephi 1.8 Toy says the land will be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations. Under the limited geography model, you have to read that as meaning only powerful old world empires.
Not that the land was totally empty of people.
Right. It allows for these smaller pre-existing populations or the strangers mentioned elsewhere in the text.
Okay, so if we accept the limited geography model, Lehites arrive in 600 BC, settle among millions of Asiatic people, it solves the macro problem. But it immediately creates a new micro problem.
And that is a critical question.
If Lehi's group, with their Hebrew origin, arrived and mixed in, why is their DNA signature still completely non-existent? Why can't we detect it at all? Why didn't that small group leave even a tiny trace?
And the official explanation today, it leans heavily on population genetics. It argues that because the group was so small and the Asiatic population so large, their genetic markers were simply lost or diluted over 2,600 years.
And our sources point to 3 specific mechanisms for how that could have happened.
They do.
So let's break those down. The science gets a bit dense here. First up is the founder effect.
The founder effect. It suggests that the small initial population, the Jaredites, Lehites, and Molochites, may have, just by random chance, carried DNA that was not representative of typical Near Eastern markers.
So, like, if the DNA of the Near East is a bag of multicolored Skittles, the small group that got on the boat just happened to randomly grab only the green ones.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah.
If that small founding group, by chance, didn't carry the most common Israelite markers, then those markers couldn't be passed on.
But the counter-argument here feels pretty strong, right?
It is.
The text itself spends so much time establishing Lehi's specific genealogy right back to Joseph and Manasseh. Critics argue it's just statistically improbable that such a specific lineage would fail to leave any detectable trace.
Especially when they supposedly grew into this vast civilization. The counterpoint is that the founder effect, while a real phenomenon, feels a bit too convenient here, to eliminate the entire specific lineage the book is built on.
Okay, so let's move to mechanism number 2, the genetic bottleneck. This one is a little more straightforward.
It is. A bottleneck just means a catastrophic reduction in population, which can eliminate genetic profiles. And we have two potential bottlenecks here.
The first being the wars in the Book of Mormon itself.
Right, the virtual destruction of the Nephites and the Jaredites. The second, and much, much larger one, was the European conquest post-Columbus. Disease and violence caused a population decline of up to 95%.
So either of those events could have theoretically wiped out a minor genetic signature.
That's the argument.
But, and this is where I start pushing back for the listener, this seems to apply very conveniently only to the Near Eastern DNA.
And that is the essential criticism. The ancient Asiatic founding population. They arrived 20,000 years ago. They survived an extreme bottleneck just to get here.
And we can still trace their lineages.
Yeah.
Very clearly.
We can trace 4,000-year-old Paleo-Eskimo DNA. So the criticism is that the bottleneck theory only seems to wipe out the Israelite markers, while leaving the much older primary Asiatic lines completely traceable and robust. That asymmetry it's hard to reconcile.
So if the big catastrophic events don't seal the deal, what about small, random changes over time? Which brings us to number 3. Genetic drift.
Genetic drift. This is all about random fluctuations from one generation to the next that cause genetic markers to decrease or just be lost entirely. It works much faster in small, isolated populations.
Do we have a real-world example of that?
Yeah, a study of Iceland showed that the majority of mitochondrial DNA from people living just 300 years ago didn't survive drift. Those specific maternal lines they died out by chance.
So the idea is the Lehites had the DNA, but they were such a tiny group among the masses that their specific lines just randomly terminated over time. They were swamped.
Precisely. The background population was huge, and drift would have sped up the loss of their genetic profiles.
But again, this runs right up against the scale described in the text itself.
It does.
Critics point out that the Book of Mormon describes millions of people, massive armies, civilizations covering the land from north to south. If the civilization was that vast, then the population was not a small, isolated group where drift would work so quickly.
And that's the grand contradiction. If the Lehites were a tiny, limited group, then drift is plausible. But if the Nephites and Lamanites grew into millions who had continent-spanning influence, as the text seems to imply,
then what?
Then the complete universal loss of their genetic markers in only 2,600 years becomes scientifically implausible.
Yeah.
Especially when modern DNA testing can map Neanderthal lineages from tens of thousands of years ago.
Okay, before we wrap up the genetics, we have to talk about the one marker that proponents held onto for years. Haplogroup X.
Ah, yes, Haplogroup X.
This was the great hope for a while, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. For a time, some argue that Haplogroup X, which you find in North American groups like the Ojibwa, was the smoking gun, the proof of Near East migration.
Because it's also found in the Middle East.
Right. So the argument was simple. It must have been brought over by Lehi's group.
So what did the subsequent research show?
That idea has now been widely rejected, even by most LDS geneticists who support historicity. And the reason is simple. It's the dating.
It's too old.
Way too old. The dating for Haplogroup X's arrival in the Americas is ancient, somewhere between 9,000 and 20,000 years ago. It places it firmly in the mainstream Beringia migration. It just arrived way too early to be connected to the Book of Mormon narrative.
So after this entire saga, the initial expectation, the shock of the findings, the textual revision, the limited geography model, what's the final synthesized position?
Well, the official position today is that the DNA evidence is inconclusive, and that secular evidence can't definitively prove or disprove the book.
Which is a crucial policy shift.
It's a move away from decades of explicit, historically grounded claims about ancestry that were, frankly, overwhelmingly contradicted by the science. It moves toward a position that requires faith to bridge that gap between the text and the evidence.
So for you, the learner, the key thing to recognize is that distinction. The real knowledge gain here is seeing that transition from a strong traditional assumption hemispheric model, principal ancestors, to a completely revised, nuanced interpretation.
The limited geography model among the ancestors.
Which was adopted in direct response to hard, inescapable scientific evidence.
The bottom line is the science, that high-resolution photo from genetics. It consistently points to ancient Asiatic origins. The arrival dates are millennia earlier than the Book of Mormon timeline.
So to remain plausible,
the traditional narrative has to drastically shrink its scope. It has to minimize the demographic and cultural influence of the Lehites on early American civilization. It fundamentally changes the story of the origin of the people of the Americas from an Israelite one to an East Asian one.
So we'll end with this question for you to mull over. If you have prophets and revelations supported by official church teachings for over a century, explicitly identifying modern Native Americans and Polynesians as Lamanites,
Yeah.
what are the profound implications when science compels a foundational change to that identity?
Right.
You have to think about the spiritual and cultural weight that Lamanite identity carries for those members, and what happens when the very basis of that identity is officially categorized as inconclusive by the institution itself.
It's a huge question.
It is. It's a question of history, science, and the evolving nature of identity itself.